committed crimes a lot of places.
And convicted by the jury of his peers.
And you know, you all want to, this is very important. You all want to intimidate people from doing the right thing, and you think that you're going to intimidate me. You all have been trying to intimidate me for 5 years, which is why I have not been able to live in my house for 5 years, because the N-word has been written on my house. Thousands of threats have come to my office, and instead of doing some legislation, when someone says something inflammatory that you know is going to cause them to be the victims of crime, you ought to do something about it. But you see, I'm not Marjorie Taylor Greene. I ain't gonna quit in a month because somebody threatens me. I took an oath to do the right thing. People came into my community and committed a crime, and I indicted them. And rest assured, if someone else comes in my community and commits a crime, I will indict them.
You just watched something seismic, and I'm telling you this is about so much more than one woman standing in one committee room in Georgia, because what Fani Willis just did in that hearing room yesterday is distill the entire rotting structure of American political intimidation into 5 years of racist terror that forced her from her own home, and this is happening right now in December 2024, while we're watching in real time as 4 of the 5 Republicans on this committee are running for statewide office in 2026. Which means we are witnessing nothing less than the weaponization of legislative oversight as a campaign commercial for ambitious authoritarian climbers who understand that there is no better way to signal loyalty to the MAGA base than to publicly humiliate a black woman who dared to indict their god emperor. And I need you to understand the historical weight of this moment, because we are watching the intersection of prosecutorial independence, racist backlash, and the systematic dismantling of accountability for those who attempted a coup. And here's the part that should make your blood run cold. Willis testified that you all have been trying to intimidate me for 5 years, which is why I have not been able to live in my house for 5 years, because the N-word has been written on my house. Thousands of threats have come to my office, which is the precise mechanism of what scholars call stochastic terrorism. And we need to be absolutely clear about what that term means, because it's not hyperbole, it's a technical description of when hostile, dehumanizing, or threat-framed rhetoric is repeatedly amplified to mass audiences. It elevates the background risk of ideologically motivated violence by unknown individuals over time. And this is exactly what has been happening to Willis since the moment she brought charges against Trump for his attempt to overturn Georgia's 2020 election results. Let me walk you through what's actually happening here, beyond the theater of the hearing itself, because Willis testified before an investigative Georgia State Senate committee that scrutinized her prosecution of President Donald Trump, and the committee at one point briefly cut Willis's microphone when she testified beyond the question she was asked, which is such a perfect crystallization of how patriarchal white power operates when it feels threatened. They literally silence the black woman who is speaking uncomfortable truths about their complicity in violence. And we need to understand that lawmakers created the Senate Special Committee on Investigations in January 2024 to look into allegations of various forms of misconduct against Willis concerning her prosecution of Mr. Trump and others over efforts to overturn Trump's 2020 election loss in Georgia, which means this entire apparatus was constructed for the explicit purpose of harassing a prosecutor who did her job, who followed the evidence, who brought charges based on a recorded phone call where Trump literally asked Georgia's Secretary of State to find enough votes to overturn an election he lost. And here's where it gets absolutely infuriating, because while Willis was being interrogated by these Republican senators, who are transparently using this hearing to boost their own political ambitions, most of the GOP members of the committee are running for higher office next year, and her attorney pointed to political advertisements on their behalf, touting their commitment to go after Willis, which means they are fundraising off of threatening this woman. They are building their entire campaigns on the premise that attacking Fani Willis is a credential, that intimidating a black female prosecutor is something to advertise. And this is what stochastic terrorism occurs when speakers with large audiences engage in frequent rhetorical attacks against political opposition, eventually inciting an ideologically aligned individual to take unpredictable, often violent action. And Willis has been living this reality for half a decade, while Republicans pretend they have nothing to do with it. Think about the psychological torture of what she described, not being able to live in your own home for 5 years, having racial slurs spray-painted on your house. Willis forcefully told the committee, "Why don't you investigate how many times my house has been swatted?" And swatting, in case you don't know, is when someone makes a false emergency call to get armed police to descend on someone's home, which is a tactic that has gotten people killed and is specifically designed to terrorize and potentially get the target murdered by police. And Willis has endured this repeatedly, while these same Republican legislators who could pass laws to protect prosecutors from this kind of coordinated harassment have instead created an entire committee to pile on to add the weight of state power to the campaign of intimidation that their movement has already unleashed. And then she invoked Marjorie Taylor Greene, and this is the part that should be seared into everyone's consciousness, because Willis said, "I ain't going to quit in a month because somebody threatened me. I took an oath to do the right thing. People came into my community and committed a crime, and I indicted them, and rest assured if someone else comes in my community and commits a crime, I will indict them again," which is such a profound statement of prosecutorial independence and democratic principle in the face of authoritarian pressure. And the reference to Greene is so pointed because Greene famously quit various positions when faced with accountability. But more than that, it's Willis drawing a contrast between herself and the MAGA politicians who fold the moment things get difficult, versus a black woman who has weathered 5 years of racist death threats and is still standing, still doing her job, still refusing to be intimidated. And you can hear in those words the entire weight of a tradition of black resistance to white terrorism that goes back centuries in this country. But we also need to reckon with how Willis ended up in this position in the first place, and the answer is painfully complex, because Willis's prosecution began to fall apart in January 2024, when a defense attorney in the case alleged that Willis was involved in an improper romantic relationship with Wade, and both Willis and Wade testified about the intimate details of their relationship, and they both vehemently denied allegations that it constituted a conflict of interest. But ultimately the Georgia Court of Appeals cited an appearance of impropriety and removed Willis from the case, and then the prosecutor who took over filed a motion informing the court of his decision to abandon the prosecution, arguing that the acts listed in the indictment are not acts I would consider sufficient to sustain a racketeering case, which means this case that was built on Trump's recorded attempt to steal an election has been effectively killed. And we have to hold two things in tension here: that Willis made a serious error in judgment that gave Trump's team the opening they needed, while also recognizing that the response to that error has been so wildly disproportionate and so clearly motivated by partisan revenge that it exposes the entire Republican project of dismantling accountability. The fact that Trump called Willis a criminal who should be prosecuted and put in jail is itself an act of stochastic terrorism from the most powerful figure in the Republican Party, a man who is about to return to the presidency with the explicit intent to weaponize the Justice Department against his perceived enemies. And Trump isn't speaking in a vacuum. He's speaking to millions of followers who have already demonstrated their willingness to engage in violence on his behalf. And when he targets someone like Willis, he knows exactly what he's doing. He's painting a target on her back, and then acting surprised when people start shooting, metaphorically and potentially literally, given that a California man has been indicted by a federal grand jury in Atlanta on charges of threatening Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis because of her prosecution of former President Donald Trump. And that's just one person who was caught, one person who was prosecuted. Imagine how many others are out there making similar threats who haven't been identified. And we need to zoom out and see this as part of a much larger pattern, because the blitz of attacks on prosecutors threatens to degrade precedent that protects prosecutorial independence and the ability to root out wrongdoing without partisan influence, which is exactly the point. Republicans have embarked on a systematic campaign to destroy the independence of any institution that might hold Trump accountable. And they're doing it by making the personal cost so high that prosecutors will think twice before taking on powerful Republicans. They're doing it by turning oversight into harassment, by transforming legitimate prosecutions into what they call lawfare, which is just their term for consequences we don't like. And the fact that this strategy has worked, that Willis has been removed from the case, that the charges have been dropped, sends a chilling message to every other prosecutor in America about what happens when you go after Trump. Think about what was actually in that indictment that Willis brought, because the case included a number of alleged acts in furtherance of a conspiracy, including a plot to send false electoral votes to Washington, claiming Trump had won in Georgia in 2020 when he lost, the breach of election systems in Coffee County, and an intimidation campaign designed to pressure Ruby Freeman, a Fulton County election worker, to falsely claim she had witnessed election tampering. And every single one of those things is a crime. Every single one of those things represents an assault on democracy itself. The scheme to send fake electors was an attempt to steal the presidency. The breach of voting systems was an attempt to undermine election security. And the targeting of Ruby Freeman was so vicious and so racist that Freeman herself had to go into hiding, had to abandon her life because Trump and Giuliani turned their followers loose on her. And now the prosecutor who tried to hold them accountable for all of that has been removed and is being dragged through committee hearings designed to humiliate her. The timing here is absolutely crucial, because this hearing happened just yesterday, December 17, 2024, which means we are less than a month away from Trump's inauguration for his second term. We are watching in real time as the architecture of authoritarian revenge is being constructed. Trump threatened, signed executive actions, and ordered investigations into his political opponents, critics, and organizations aligned with the Democratic Party, which is the opening move of what scholars of authoritarianism have been warning about for years. The way that autocrats consolidate power is by systematically destroying anyone who represents a threat and making examples of them so that others fall in line, and Willis is being made into that example right now. She is being held up as a cautionary tale about what happens to prosecutors who dare to indict Trump. But here's what should absolutely enrage you about the substance of what these Republican senators are investigating, because they're not actually investigating Willis's decision to bring charges. They're not examining the evidence that Trump tried to overturn the election. Instead, the resolution creating the committee focused on Willis's hiring of special prosecutor Nathan Wade to lead the election interference case, and it said a romantic relationship between the two amounted to a clear conflict of interest and a fraud upon the taxpayers, which is such a transparent deflection from the actual crimes that were charged. And yes, Willis should have been more careful about avoiding any appearance of impropriety, but the Republican fixation on her personal relationship rather than Trump's attempt to steal an election tells you everything you need to know about their priorities. They would rather talk about who Willis was dating than about the fact that Trump was recorded asking election officials to manufacture votes, and Willis called them out on this directly because Willis repeatedly insulted the premise of the panel itself, calling it a QAnon committee, and said white senators were pursuing her because she is black, and she had indicted white and influential people, and she's absolutely right. This is about race and power, and the protection of white supremacist hierarchy, because in what universe would a white male prosecutor who brought the same charges face this level of scrutiny and harassment? In what universe would legislators create an entire committee to investigate a white man who did his job? And the answer is never. This only happens to Willis because she is a black woman who refused to know her place, who refused to accept that some people are above the law, who actually believed that the principle of equal justice applied even to former presidents. I want to focus on something that often gets lost in these discussions, which is the compound trauma of being a black woman in a position of power who faces this kind of onslaught, because Willis isn't just dealing with political pressure, she's dealing with explicitly racist threats, with people writing the N-word on her house, with a level of dehumanization that is designed to break you psychologically, and the fact that she has withstood this for 5 years while continuing to do her job is extraordinary. But we shouldn't have to celebrate extraordinary resilience in the face of terrorism. We should be building systems that protect prosecutors from this kind of coordinated attack, and instead Republicans are actively amplifying the threats by giving them the veneer of legislative legitimacy. The concept of stochastic terrorism is so important here because it allows us to understand how violence is outsourced and responsibility is diffused. Scholars typically employ a 3-part structure: an originator, often a public figure, amplifying forces, typically mass media platforms, and ultimate receivers who may act without direct coordination. According to this framework, originators deploy hostile rhetoric toward identified outgroups while avoiding explicit calls for violence. Amplifiers repeat and spread the messages, causing some receivers to internalize the content and take action once a personal threshold is reached. And we can see this exact pattern with Willis, where Trump and Republican officials make inflammatory statements about her. Conservative media amplifies those attacks, and then individual actors send death threats or show up at her house, and then everyone claims they had nothing to do with the violence, even though they created the conditions for it. And Republicans are now taking this playbook and institutionalizing it through legislative oversight because that's what this Georgia Senate committee represents. It's the state itself joining the campaign of intimidation. Former Governor Roy Barnes, an attorney for Willis, told the committee that it was engaged in a witch hunt, which is exactly right. This is a witch hunt in the original sense of that term, a campaign of persecution against a woman who threatens patriarchal power, and the fact that they're dressing it up in the language of oversight and accountability doesn't change the fundamental nature of what's happening. We also need to talk about what happened to the case itself, because the prosecution was formally dropped last month, after Willis was disqualified, and, in my professional judgment, the citizens of Georgia are not served by pursuing this case in full for another 5 to 10 years, wrote Pete Skandalakis, the executive director of the Prosecuting Attorneys Council of Georgia, and this is how accountability dies. Not with a bang, but with administrative decisions about resource allocation and political calculus. and the result is that Trump will face no consequences in Georgia for his attempt to overturn the election. The people who participated in the fake elector scheme will face no consequences. The people who breached election systems will face no consequences, and the message is clear, that if you're powerful enough, and you can generate enough political pressure, you are effectively above the law. But Willis isn't backing down, and that's what makes her testimony yesterday so important, because she stood in front of that committee and basically said, you can harass me all you want, but I'm not going anywhere. I brought this case because they came in this jurisdiction and broke the law, Willis said, and they didn't only break the law here, they broke it in other places. And that's such a crucial point because Trump's attempt to overturn the election wasn't limited to Georgia. It was a multi-state conspiracy that included similar schemes in Arizona and Michigan and other states, and Willis is reminding everyone that the crimes were real, the evidence was substantial, and the only reason Trump isn't being held accountable is because of political interference and her own mistakes that gave them an opening, and we need to connect this to the broader assault on democratic institutions that is accelerating as we speak, because the DOJ fired more than a dozen officials who worked on criminal cases against Trump, alleging a lack of trust in faithfully executing his agenda, and announced a special project to investigate prosecutors who had previously brought charges against January 6 United States Capitol attack rioters, and launched a weaponization working group to review and investigate officials at both the state and federal levels who previously investigated Trump, which means the Trump administration is explicitly creating machinery to go after anyone who tried to hold him accountable. They're not even pretending this is about justice or the rule of law. They're openly admitting it's about revenge. The historical parallel here is so obvious it's almost painful because we've seen this movie before in countries that have transitioned from democracy to authoritarianism. The pattern is always the same. You target the prosecutors, you target the judges, you target the journalists. You systematically dismantle any institution that might provide a check on executive power, and you do it by making examples of people, by showing everyone what happens when you cross the leader, and Willis is being made into one of those examples right now while we watch, and the question is whether there will be any institutional resistance or whether prosecutors and judges will internalize the lesson and start pulling their punches. I need you to understand the stakes of what we're witnessing, because Nixon presidential historian Timothy Naftali described the persecution of liberal groups as similar to Nixon's desire to punish political enemies and critics, but that a pliant Republican Congress allowed Trump to go further, and described this particular moment as more dangerous for the rule of law in the United States than the 1970s were. And that should terrify you because Watergate was a constitutional crisis that nearly brought down the Republic, and we're being told by serious historians that what's happening now is worse, that the guardrails are weaker, that the Republican Party has abandoned any pretense of checking presidential abuses, and we're seeing that play out in real time in this Georgia committee room, where Republicans are using state power to harass a prosecutor who did her job. The fact that Willis referenced Trump being convicted by a jury of his peers is also crucial because she's pointing out the crux of Willis's indictments was a January 2021 phone call between Trump and Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, in which the then-president asked Raffensperger to find enough votes for Trump to carry Georgia. And that call is on tape. We all heard it. Trump is literally asking an election official to manufacture votes so he could win. And yet somehow Willis is the one being investigated. Somehow she's the one being dragged through committee hearings and facing death threats, while Trump is preparing to be inaugurated as president again. And if that doesn't demonstrate the complete inversion of accountability in American politics, I don't know what does. And I want to come back to Willis's invocation of doing the right thing, because she's speaking in a moral register that has deep roots in the Black freedom struggle, the idea that there is a higher principle than personal safety, that there are things worth standing up for, even when the cost is enormous. And I took an oath to do the right thing. People came into my community and committed a crime, and I indicted them, and rest assured if someone else comes in my community and commits a crime, I will indict them again, which is a declaration that she will not be moved, that she will continue to do her job regardless of the threats, and that's the kind of moral courage that we need to be celebrating and protecting rather than subjecting to legislative harassment. But we also have to reckon with the ways that the prosecution was undermined, not just by external pressure, but by Willis's own decisions, because the romantic relationship with Nathan Wade was a serious lapse in judgment that gave Trump's team exactly the kind of ammunition they needed to discredit the case. And we can acknowledge that while also recognizing that the punishment has been wildly disproportionate, that the political weaponization of that mistake is designed to accomplish something much larger than accountability for ethical lapses. It's designed to kill the case entirely and to send a message to other prosecutors, and it succeeded. The other dimension of this that's so insidious is the way that Republicans have framed Willis's prosecution of Trump as the real witch hunt, as politically motivated persecution. Republican Senator Dolezal rejected Willis's characterization and called the initial investigation into Trump and the other defendants the real witch hunt, which is such a perfect example of how authoritarian movements co-opt the language of their opponents. They take the legitimate criticism that Trump is engaging in political persecution, and they flip it around and claim that any attempt to hold Trump accountable is itself persecution. And this rhetorical move is incredibly effective because it muddies the waters and creates a false equivalence between prosecuting actual crimes and politically motivated harassment. We're also seeing this pattern with other prosecutors who have gone after Trump because the attacks on Willis are part of a much broader campaign that includes Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg, who prosecuted Trump on the hush money case. House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan demanded the prosecutors Alvin Bragg and Matthew Colangelo appear for a June hearing on the weaponization of the federal government and the unprecedented political prosecution of Trump, which demonstrates that Republicans have created an entire infrastructure for harassing prosecutors. They're using congressional committees and now state legislative committees to investigate and intimidate anyone who brings charges against Trump or his allies, and the cumulative effect is to make prosecution itself politically dangerous. And here's the part that should make you absolutely furious. Willis's re-election campaign accused the committee of trying to dig up dirt, slow us down, and distract Fani Willis from her job. And the email asks people to pack the hearing room in the Capitol or to send her a campaign donation saying, "We want to make today, the day they tried to tear her down, our single biggest fundraising day of the year," which means Willis is having to spend time and energy defending herself and raising money to fight these political attacks instead of doing her actual job as a prosecutor. And that's the point. The goal is to make the cost of accountability so high that it becomes impossible to do the work. The silence from too many Democrats on this is also damning, because where is the sustained outcry about what's being done to Willis? Where are the congressional investigations into the threats against prosecutors? Where is the legislation to protect DAs from this kind of coordinated harassment? And the answer is that Democrats have largely failed to mount an adequate defense of these institutions. They've allowed Republicans to frame the narrative. They've been defensive and reactive rather than going on offense about the assault on prosecutorial independence. And that failure has created space for the attacks to intensify. What Willis did yesterday in that hearing room was refuse the script, refuse to be cowed, refuse to play the role of the apologetic defendant, and instead she went on offense. She called out the committee for their political motivations. She highlighted the racism inherent in their attacks. She reminded everyone that Trump committed crimes and would have faced trial if not for political interference. And most importantly, she declared her intention to continue doing her job, and that kind of defiance is absolutely essential right now, because the only way to resist authoritarian pressure is to refuse to be intimidated, to keep doing the work even when the cost is high. But we have to be honest about where we are as a country, because the fact that a prosecutor can be driven from her home for 5 years, can face thousands of death threats, can have racial slurs painted on her house, can be swatted repeatedly, and the response from the Republican Party is to create a committee to investigate her, rather than to investigate the threats, tells you everything you need to know about their commitment to democracy, about their commitment to the rule of law, about their commitment to anything other than protecting Trump at all costs. And this is happening against the backdrop of Trump preparing to return to the White House with explicit plans for retribution, because we need to understand that this isn't just about one prosecutor in Georgia. This is about the systematic destruction of accountability mechanisms across the entire country. And if we don't mount a serious defense of these institutions, if we don't make it politically costly to engage in this kind of harassment, if we don't create real protections for prosecutors and judges and election officials who are doing their jobs, then we will wake up in a country where no one is willing to hold the powerful accountable because the personal cost has become too high. What Fani Willis showed us yesterday is that resistance is still possible, that there are still people willing to stand up even in the face of enormous pressure, that the tradition of courage and principle that has sustained the fight for justice in this country is not dead, but she shouldn't have to do this alone. She shouldn't have to be a hero just to do her job, and the fact that we're relying on individual acts of courage rather than robust institutional protections is itself a sign of how far we've fallen, and we need to understand that time is running out to reverse course, that the window for defending democratic accountability is closing, and that what happens to Fani Willis is a preview of what will happen to anyone else who dares to stand up to authoritarian power.